The portrait was never meant to be found. That's what I keep telling myself as I stare at the wooden crate before me. My name is Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, and as the new curator of the Thornfield Museum of Fine Arts, I've made it my mission to catalog every forgotten piece in our vast storage rooms. 3 generations of donations, acquisitions, and transfers had created a labyrinth of art and artifacts, many untouched for decades. This particular crate arrived in 1952, according to the faded shipping label. Never opened, never displayed. The dust that covers it speaks of neglect and secrecy. As I pry open the wooden slats, the scent of aged varnish and old canvas fills the air. The musty odor of history floods my nostrils, a tangible reminder of the passage of time. I never could have imagined what was waiting inside. A portrait, a woman's portrait from the late Victorian era, judging by the style and frame. The painting itself is remarkable. A young woman, perhaps 25, with piercing eyes that seem to follow you across the room. Her hair is pulled back severely, yet a few rebellious strands escape around her temples, giving her a touch of humanity amid the formal pose. Her high-collared dress is black, contrasting sharply with her pale skin. The artist had captured a certain luminosity in her complexion, as though she were lit from within. Her expression is unreadable. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown, as if she's keeping a secret that weighs on her soul. There's a note attached to the back, yellowed with age. The paper is brittle, threatening to crumble at my touch. I handle it with the reverence it deserves, squinting to make out the faded ink. Property of Blackwood Estate, 1897. Artist, Frederick Holloway. Subject, unidentified. Unidentified? How curious. A portrait of this quality would typically name its subject, especially from a prestigious estate sharing my surname. Could this be a distant relative? The coincidence is too striking to ignore. I find myself studying her features more closely, searching for any resemblance to my own. I carefully transport the portrait to our conservation lab. Standard procedure for any newly discovered piece. Document, clean, and assess. The conservation lab is my sanctuary, a place where time seems suspended. The scent of archival materials and gentle cleaning solutions replaces the dust of storage. As I photograph the canvas under different lighting conditions, something unexpected happens. Under ultraviolet light, something appears across the bottom of the canvas. Letters, words, hidden from ordinary view but clearly visible now in an eerie, glowing blue script. She knows what we did. 5 words. Simple, yet chilling. Who is she? The woman in the portrait? What did they do? And why hide this message in invisible ink, only revealed under specific light conditions that wouldn't have been common in 1897? The questions multiply in my mind, each one leading to darker possibilities. I didn't know it then, but these 5 words would lead me down a path into darkness. A darkness that began over a century ago, in the very town where I now stand. London, 1897. The gaslights flickered across the cobblestone streets as Frederick Holloway made his way through the evening fog. The air was heavy with coal smoke and the damp chill of approaching winter. His footsteps echoed on the wet stone, occasionally joined by the clatter of carriage wheels or the distant call of a street vendor closing shop for the night. His studio was in a fashionable part of London, but his current commission had taken him to the imposing Blackwood Estate on the city's outskirts. Frederick adjusted his top hat and checked his pocket watch, its gold surface catching the dim light of the street lamps. 7 minutes past 6. He was already late for his final sitting with Miss Blackwood. Lord Thomas Blackwood, the family patriarch, was not a man who tolerated tardiness, especially from those he considered beneath his station. Frederick had witnessed the man's cold fury directed at servants who failed to meet his exacting standards, and had no desire to experience it himself. The door swung open to reveal Harrison, the Blackwood butler, his face a mask of practiced indifference. His immaculate black suit seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and his posture was rigid as a soldier's. "Mr. Holloway," he intoned, "the family awaits you in the drawing room." The slight emphasis on awaits was the only indication of Frederick's tardiness. Frederick nodded, handing over his coat and hat. The Blackwood estate was a monument to wealth and privilege. Marble floors imported from Italy, tapestries from the Orient, priceless art adorning every wall, crystal chandeliers hung from ornately plastered ceilings, their hundreds of facets catching and multiplying the light from gas lamps. Old money, old power, the kind of power that shaped empires and crushed opposition without remorse. As he entered the drawing room, three figures turned to acknowledge him. Lord Thomas Blackwood stood by the fireplace, tumbler of whiskey in hand, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes cold as January frost. At 65, he still possessed the vigor and intimidating presence that had made him one of London's most feared businessmen. Beside him, his son James, 30 years old with his father's bearing but none of his restraint, a man known throughout London's exclusive clubs for his gambling and drinking. His handsome features were marred by a perpetual sneer, as though the world and everyone in it were beneath his contempt. And then there was Evelyn Blackwood. She sat perfectly still by the window, the fading evening light casting half her face in shadow. 23 years old, with chestnut hair and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. Unlike her father and brother, whose expressions were easy to read, Evelyn's face revealed nothing. She was the reason Frederick had been commissioned. Her portrait was to announce her engagement to Lord William Hastings, scion of another wealthy family. The marriage would unite two powerful dynasties, cementing the Blackwoods' position in society, even as whispers of financial troubles began to circulate. "You're late, Holloway," Lord Thomas said, not bothering to look at him. His voice was like gravel, worn smooth by years of issuing commands and closing deals. "My apologies, Lord Blackwood." The fog delayed the hansoms. Frederick kept his tone respectful, but not servile. He was, after all, an artist of some renown, not a common laborer. "Excuses," Thomas muttered, taking another sip of whiskey. The amber liquid caught the firelight as he swirled it in the crystal tumbler. "Let's get this finished. The unveiling is in 3 days." Frederick nodded, setting up his materials near the chair where Evelyn sat. The familiar routine calmed his nerves, arranging brushes by size, organizing his palette, adjusting the easel to the proper height and angle. He had been working on her portrait for weeks now, capturing her likeness with a precision that had made him one of London's most sought-after portrait artists. Today was for final details: the gleam in her eyes, the exact curve of her lips, the subtle interplay of light and shadow that would bring the painting to life. As he prepared his paints, carefully mixing colors to achieve the precise shade he needed, he noticed something different about Evelyn. Usually composed and distant, today she seemed alert, tense. Her fingers gripped the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles were white. The perfect posture she had maintained through all their previous sessions now seemed forced, as though it took all her strength to remain still. "Miss Blackwood," he said quietly, not wanting to attract the attention of her father and brother who had moved to the far end of the room to discuss business matters. "Are you quite well?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw something there: fear, resolve, a silent plea. She glanced quickly at her father and brother, then back to Frederick. "Perfectly well, Mr. Holloway," she replied, her voice steady despite her apparent tension. "I'm merely eager to have this completed." The words were correct, the expected response of a society lady, but her eyes told a different story. Frederick nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to press the matter in front of her family. He began to work, adding subtle touches to the nearly completed portrait. With each stroke of his brush, he tried to capture not just her appearance, but the essence of her that he glimpsed in these unguarded moments. The intelligence behind her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the hint of defiance in the tilt of her chin. "I'll need to take this back to my studio for the final varnishing," Frederick said after an hour of work. He stepped back, evaluating the portrait with a critical eye. "It will be ready for the unveiling." Lord Thomas nodded curtly, setting down his now empty tumbler. "See that it is. The Hastings family and several prominent families will be in attendance. This portrait needs to reflect the dignity of both our houses." The portrait also needed to hide any hint of the Blackwood family's rumored financial difficulties. Frederick had heard whispers in his social circles: investments gone wrong, ships lost at sea, competitors gaining ground. Nothing concrete, but enough to make the Hastings alliance essential for the Blackwoods' continued prosperity. As Frederick packed his supplies, carefully cleaning his brushes and storing them in their leather roll, Evelyn suddenly stood. The abrupt movement drew sharp glances from both her father and brother. "Father, I wish to speak with Mr. Holloway about a possible landscape commission for the East drawing room." Her voice was perfectly modulated, giving no indication of her earlier tension. Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "If you must, James and I have business to discuss anyway. Don't leave the house, Evelyn." The warning in his voice was unmistakable. Frederick pretended not to notice as he followed Evelyn into the adjoining conservatory. its glass walls now dark with night, the exotic plants within reduced to looming shadows. The air was heavy with the scent of orchids and damp earth, a stark contrast to the formal drawing room they had left behind. Once they were alone, Evelyn's composure cracked, her shoulders sagged, and her carefully neutral expression gave way to one of urgency. "Mr. Holloway, I don't have much time," she whispered, glancing back at the door that connected to the drawing room. "They'll wonder why we're talking so long." Frederick set down his case. "Miss Blackwood, what's wrong?" She glanced nervously at the door. "I need your help. I can't marry Lord Hastings. I need to leave London, leave England entirely." Her words tumbled out in a hurried whisper, each one edged with desperation. Frederick blinked in surprise. "I don't understand. The engagement was arranged without my consent," she interrupted. "But that's not why I need to escape." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've discovered something terrible about my father and brother." "About their business dealings." Frederick shifted uncomfortably. The Blackwoods Shipping Company was one of the largest in England, with connections throughout the empire. Their vessels transported everything from tea and spices to textiles and timber. Rumors occasionally surfaced about questionable practices, but nothing was ever proven against a family with such power and influence. "What have you discovered?" he asked cautiously, lowering his voice even further. In the shadowy conservatory, with steam rising from the heated pipes that kept the tropical plants alive through the London winter, their conversation felt conspiratorial, dangerous. Evelyn's eyes darted again to the door. She moved closer, close enough that Frederick could smell the lavender water she wore. "Their ships aren't just carrying textiles and spices from India. They're smuggling opium, massive quantities. The manifests I've seen list innocent cargo, but there are separate ledgers, hidden ones, that show the truth." Frederick felt his heart rate quicken. Opium smuggling was a serious accusation, though not an uncommon practice among certain shipping companies. The trade with China was immensely profitable, despite increasing restrictions. And when competitors threatened to expose them, her voice dropped even lower. "People disappear, Mr. Holloway. Warehouse fires, boating accidents, 3 in the past year alone." Frederick felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. This was far worse than mere smuggling. "Are you certain?" "I found my father's ledgers, hidden records, names, dates, payments to men I've never heard of. And last week, I overheard them discussing a man named Phillips who was becoming a problem. The next day, I read in the Times that Edward Phillips, who owned a rival shipping company, was found dead in the Thames." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the dead man's name. Her hands were shaking now. She clasped them together to still them. "They saw me, Mr. Holloway, in my father's study. I pretended I had just entered, but I saw the look they exchanged. They know I suspect something, even if they're not certain what I've seen or heard." The danger of her situation struck Frederick with sudden clarity. If what she said was true, if her father and brother were indeed responsible for murder, then her life was in peril. Once married to Lord Hastings and isolated in his country estate, she would be at their mercy. A convenient accident, perhaps, or a sudden illness. Society would mourn the tragic young bride, and that would be the end of it. Frederick ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she was telling him. "What do you expect me to do?" "The unveiling celebration. There will be over 100 guests. In the commotion I can slip away, but I need somewhere to go. Someone who can help me reach the continent. I have some money saved, jewelry I can sell." Her eyes pleaded with him. "I know it's an enormous risk, but I have no one else to turn to." "And you think I can provide this escape route?" She looked at him intently. "You have connections in Paris. I've heard you speak of the artists there, the galleries that show your work. Please, Mr. Holloway." "I don't think I have much time." Before Frederick could respond, the door to the conservatory opened. James Blackwood stood there, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Frederick instinctively stepped away from Evelyn, though they had been doing nothing improper, at least not visibly. "Sister," James said smoothly, "Father wonders what's taking so long. Surely Mr. Holloway understands the basic concept of a landscape commission." His tone was light, conversational, but there was an undercurrent of suspicion that made Frederick's skin prickle. Evelyn's face immediately resumed its mask of calm indifference. The transformation was remarkable. In an instant, the frightened, desperate woman was gone, replaced by the poised daughter of privilege. Of course, Mr. Holloway was just explaining what locations might work best given the light in the east drawing room. Frederick nodded, gathering his case. "Indeed, Miss Blackwood has excellent taste. If you'll excuse me, I should be on my way." He kept his voice steady, giving no indication of the tumultuous thoughts racing through his mind. As he moved to leave, James placed a hand on his shoulder, gripping it just firmly enough to be uncomfortable. Frederick could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the slight redness around his eyes that spoke of regular drinking. "The portrait, it captures my sister perfectly, doesn't it?" James asked, his gaze boring into Frederick's. There was something in his tone that made Frederick's skin crawl, a subtle menace, a hint that he knew more than he was letting on. "I believe it does," Frederick replied carefully. James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. We want her remembered exactly as she is at this moment in her life. Don't we, Evelyn?" The threat was barely veiled. Frederick saw Evelyn stiffen almost imperceptibly before nodding, her face a perfect mask of composure. "Good night, Mr. Holloway," James said, finally releasing his grip. "We'll see you at the unveiling." Music transition. Frederick couldn't sleep that night. His small apartment above his studio on Regent Street felt suffocating as he paced back and forth, Evelyn's words echoing in his mind. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, a rhythmic accompaniment to his troubled thoughts. Through the window he could see the fog-shrouded street below, occasional figures hurrying past, collars turned up against the damp night air. Smuggling, murder, and a young woman caught in the middle of it. He had no reason to doubt her. The Blackwoods' ruthless business reputation was well known, even if the specifics remained shadowy. People spoke in hushed tones about how Lord Thomas had expanded his shipping empire, eliminating competitors through means that were seldom entirely legal. And Frederick had seen the fear in Evelyn's eyes, genuine fear, not the manufactured emotion of a society lady seeking adventure or escape from an unwanted marriage, but the raw terror of someone who believed her life was in danger. But helping her meant risking everything he had built, his reputation, his livelihood, possibly his life, if what she said about her family was true. In the 10 years since he had established himself in London, Frederick had carefully cultivated connections with the right people, painted portraits of the right families. He was finally achieving the success he had dreamed of as a student at the Royal Academy. To throw it all away on a desperate gamble. The clock on his mantel chimed midnight, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet apartment. Outside, a carriage clattered past, its wheels splashing through puddles, the rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves fading into the distance. At his easel sat Evelyn's nearly completed portrait. He had brought it back to his studio as promised, to apply the final touches and varnish. In the dim lamplight, her eyes seemed to follow him, pleading silently. Frederick stared back at the canvas, studying the face he had created stroke by stroke over the past weeks. He knew every nuance of her expression, every shadow and highlight that gave her features life, and in that familiar face, he now saw something he hadn't consciously captured, a trapped soul. He picked up his brush and a small bottle of clear liquid from his workbench. It was a solution of his own making, an experiment in techniques he had learned during his time in Florence. Quinine, dissolved in water, was invisible when dry, but would fluoresce under certain conditions. Most would consider it a parlor trick, useful perhaps for theatrical productions but not serious art. Carefully, meticulously, he began to apply it to the bottom of the canvas, just above the frame. The liquid dried quickly, invisible to the naked eye. 5 words, written in his neat, precise hand. "She knows what we did. Insurance," he murmured to himself, setting the brush aside. If anything happened to him, or to Evelyn, someone someday might discover what he had written. Proof that he hadn't been complicit in whatever was to come. A message that might eventually lead to justice, even if he wasn't alive to see it. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Frederick contacted an old friend from his student days in Paris, now a merchant with a ship departing for France the night of the unveiling. Claude Renaud had once owed Frederick a significant debt, both financial and personal. Now it was time to call it in. Money changed hands, arrangements were made. A cabin secured for a cousin traveling under an assumed name. Frederick spent the afternoon meticulously finalizing the portrait. The varnish he applied would protect it for decades, perhaps centuries. Long after he and Evelyn were gone, this image would remain. The thought gave him a strange comfort as he worked, knowing that whatever happened next, some part of them would endure. When evening fell, Frederick carefully wrapped Evelyn's portrait and summoned a carriage to take him to the Blackwood estate. Rain had begun to fall, a fine, persistent drizzle that soaked through clothing and chilled to the bone. The streets were quieter than usual. most Londoners having sought shelter from the inclement weather. The Blackwood mansion, however, was ablaze with light. Carriages lined the circular drive, footmen with umbrellas assisting elegantly dressed guests as they arrived. The sounds of an orchestra drifted through the open windows, mingling with the patter of rain and the murmur of refined conversation. Harrison took the portrait from him at the door, his face as impassive as ever. "The unveiling will take place in the main hall at 9 o'clock, the butler informed him. "Lord Blackwood requests that you be present to answer any questions about your work." Frederick nodded, scanning the crowded rooms for any sign of Evelyn. The mansion's interior had been transformed for the occasion. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, their scent almost overwhelming in the warm air. Footmen circulated with trays of champagne, and the orchestra played discreetly in one corner of the grand salon. The cream of London society had turned out for the event, drawn as much by curiosity about the rumors surrounding the Blackwoods as by genuine interest in the portrait. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen, but Lord Thomas spotted Frederick immediately, beckoning him over to a group of distinguished-looking gentlemen. He wore evening dress, his chest adorned with several medals speaking to service to the Empire. His beard was freshly trimmed, and his eyes gleamed with an energy that seemed almost feverish. A tall, thin man with a monocle inclined his head. William Hastings, Frederick presumed. His face was aristocratic and cold, at least 30 years older than Evelyn. "I expect nothing but excellence," Hastings said, his tone making it clear that this was both a statement and a warning. "The portrait represents my best work," Frederick replied diplomatically. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "It had better. Now where is that daughter of mine? She should be down by now." As if on cue, James appeared at his father's elbow, his expression tense. "Father, a word." The two men stepped away, conferring in urgent whispers. Frederick couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Thomas's face darken with rage before composing itself into a mask of calm. When they returned, Thomas's smile was fixed in place. "A slight delay in our proceedings, gentlemen. My daughter is feeling unwell and needs a few moments to compose herself. Women's nerves, you understand." The men around him nodded knowingly, but Frederick felt a stab of concern. Had their plan been discovered? "Perhaps I should check that the portrait is properly positioned for the unveiling," Frederick suggested, trying to sound casual. "That won't be necessary," James cut in smoothly. "Everything has been arranged. Harrison is quite competent." Frederick forced a smile and excused himself, moving through the crowded rooms with as much nonchalance as he could muster. He needed to find Evelyn, to make sure she was still able to carry out their plan. The ship wouldn't wait past midnight. As he reached the bottom of the grand staircase, intending to somehow make his way upstairs, a hand gripped his arm. He turned to find Harrison, the butler's impassive face inches from his own. "Mr. Holloway," he said quietly, "Miss Blackwood requests your presence in the library." Regarding the portrait, Frederick's heart raced. "Lead the way." The library was dark when they entered, lit only by a single lamp on a massive desk. As Harrison closed the door behind them, Frederick's eyes adjusted to the dimness. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Lord Thomas sat at the desk, James standing beside him. On the desk lay a leather-bound ledger. "Mr. Holloway," Thomas said, his voice dangerously soft. "Do sit down." Frederick remained standing. "Where is Miss Blackwood?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "My daughter is indisposed. Hysterical, one might say. She seems to have developed some fantastical notions." "About your business practices?" Frederick said before he could stop himself. Thomas and James exchanged a look. "So she has confided in you," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "How unfortunate. For both of you." James moved toward Frederick, his posture threatening. He was taller than Frederick, broader in the shoulders, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he would enjoy physical confrontation. But Thomas raised a hand, stopping him. "Not yet. I want to understand the full extent of this indiscretion." He tapped the ledger on his desk. The lamp cast strange shadows across his face, making his features seem distorted, almost demonic. "My daughter has misinterpreted some complex business matters that are frankly beyond her comprehension, and now it seems beyond yours as well." Frederick stood his ground, though his instincts screamed at him to flee. Smuggling opium? Murdering competitors? Are these the complex business matters she misinterpreted? He kept his voice steady despite his racing heart. Thomas sighed, the sound like wind through dead leaves. "The opium trade is perfectly legal, Mr. Holloway. The Crown profits enormously from it. As for these alleged murders, he shrugged, a dismissive gesture that spoke volumes about his indifference to human life. Business is competitive. Accidents happen. And Edward Phillips? Was that an accident too? Frederick held Thomas's gaze, refusing to be intimidated despite the cold fear spreading through his veins. A flash of surprise crossed Thomas's face before he composed himself. For a moment his mask slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. You're well informed. Yes, poor Phillips. Tragic. The Thames is dangerous at night. His tone was conversational, as though discussing the weather rather than a man's death. Frederick took a step back toward the door, only to find Harrison blocking his way. The butler's face remained expressionless, but his posture was that of a soldier awaiting orders. Frederick realized with a sinking feeling that Harrison's loyalties lay with Thomas, not Evelyn. Any hope that the butler might be an ally vanished. What do you intend to do? Frederick asked, trying to keep his voice level. He needed to play for time, to find some way out of this situation, and more importantly, to learn what had happened to Evelyn. Thomas closed the ledger and stood. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, a man accustomed to power, to having others wait on his pleasure. That depends entirely on you, Mr. Holloway. You're a man of reputation, of standing in certain circles. I respect that, so I'm offering you a choice. He walked around the desk, each step measured, until he stood directly before Frederick. Forget everything Evelyn told you. Complete the unveiling tonight. Return to your studio and continue your successful career. A career that will flourish with the Blackwood family's continued patronage. The offer hung in the air between them. Thomas's eyes were cold, assessing, the eyes of a predator evaluating whether his prey would submit or require more forceful measures. And if I refuse? Frederick asked, though he already knew the answer. Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then, like Phillips, you'll have suffered an unfortunate accident, perhaps while intoxicated. Artists are known for such vices, after all. The threat was delivered with the same casual tone one might use to comment on a change in the weather. Frederick thought quickly. His priority had to be Evelyn's safety. If he defied Thomas now, he might never learn what had happened to her. And Evelyn? My daughter will marry Lord Hastings as planned. She'll live a life of privilege and comfort, far from London. Hastings's estate in the country will provide the perfect environment for her to recover from her delusions. The euphemism was chilling, suggesting a future of forced confinement and possible drugging to ensure Evelyn's compliance. The threat was clear. Frederick glanced at Harrison, then at James, calculating his chances of fighting his way out. The butler was older, but stood with the confidence of a man experienced in physical confrontation. James was younger, stronger, and had the look of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. They were not good odds. What guarantee do I have that you'll keep your word if I cooperate? He asked, playing for time. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, any plan that might lead to escape for both himself and Evelyn. Thomas seemed amused by the question, his lips curving in a patronizing smile. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Mr. Holloway. But very well, I am a businessman. Complete the unveiling tonight. Tomorrow, you'll receive a bank draft for twice your commission fee. Consider it compensation for your discretion. Frederick nodded slowly as if considering the offer. He needed to appear compliant while gathering information. And I assume you'll want me to tell you exactly what arrangements I've made for Evelyn's escape? Thomas smiled coldly. Naturally. His fingers drummed on the desk, the only sign of impatience in his otherwise composed demeanor. Frederick took a deep breath. What he said next could either buy them time or seal their fates. He chose his words carefully, mixing truth with falsehood. There's a merchant ship leaving for Paris at midnight, the Northern Star. I arranged passage for her under the name Catherine Wells. A carriage was to collect her from the side entrance during the unveiling. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, but with key details changed. The ship was real, but scheduled to depart the following night. The assumed name was different, as was the arranged meeting point. Small lies that might buy precious time if believed. Thomas nodded to James, who immediately left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Frederick felt sick, knowing he had just betrayed Evelyn's trust, even if partially. But he needed to create an opportunity to find her, to ascertain if she was still in the house and under what conditions. A wise decision, Mr. Holloway, Thomas said, his tone softening now that he believed he had won. Now, I believe we have an unveiling to attend. Harrison will escort you. The butler stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Frederick's elbow. The touch was polite, almost deferential, but Frederick was under no illusion about its purpose. Harrison would not let him out of his sight. As they left the library, Frederick caught a glimpse of movement at the top of the stairs, a flash of fabric, quickly disappearing. Evelyn? Or just a servant going about their duties? Hope flared briefly in his chest, then dimmed as Harrison steered him firmly toward the main hall. Music transition. The unveiling proceeded exactly as planned. The portrait, set on an easel and covered with a velvet cloth of deep burgundy, stood at the center of the main hall. Footmen had arranged chairs in semicircles facing the easel, while others circulated with champagne flutes on silver trays. The orchestra had moved to this room, playing a gentle minuet that provided an elegant backdrop to the assembled guests' conversation. Frederick stood nearby, scanning the crowd for any sign of Evelyn. The guests were a who's who of London society. Politicians, industrialists, old aristocracy, and new money, all mingling in a carefully choreographed dance of social interaction. Ladies in silk gowns adorned with pearls and diamonds whispered behind fans, while gentlemen in impeccable evening wear discussed politics and business ventures. Yet there was no sign of the woman whose portrait they had all come to see. Thomas Blackwood stepped onto a small dais beside the easel, tapping a silver spoon against his champagne glass to call for attention. The orchestra fell silent, and the assembled guests turned expectantly toward their host. "Distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, dear friends," Thomas began, his voice resonant and confident. "It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this special occasion. As many of you know, my beloved daughter Evelyn is soon to enter into a most advantageous alliance with the illustrious Hastings family." He nodded toward Lord Hastings, who inclined his head in acknowledgement. "To mark this momentous occasion, I commissioned one of London's most talented portrait artists to capture my daughter's likeness, a portrait that will stand as a testament to the union of our great families for generations to come." Thomas continued his speech, expounding on family legacy and the importance of marking momentous occasions through art. Frederick barely heard the words. His eyes continued to search the room, the doorways, the staircase beyond. Anywhere Evelyn might appear. Harrison stood at his elbow, a constant presence ensuring he didn't stray. James was nowhere to be seen, presumably still investigating the false lead Frederick had provided about the ship. "And now," Thomas concluded, "I present to you my daughter, Evelyn Blackwood, soon to be Lady Hastings, immortalized by the talented Mr. Frederick Holloway." With a flourish worthy of a stage magician, he pulled away the velvet cloth. Gasps of appreciation filled the room as the portrait was revealed in the warm lamplight. Frederick had indeed done some of his finest work. Evelyn's likeness was striking, her eyes hauntingly real. He had captured not just her appearance, but something of her essence. The intelligence, the quiet determination, the hint of sadness that had always lurked behind her composed exterior. Lord Hastings stepped forward, examining the portrait with critical eyes. He circled it slowly, studying it from different angles, his monocle glinting in the lamplight. "Exceptional," he declared finally. "She looks almost alive." His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. "A credit to your skill, Holloway." Thomas smiled tightly. "Indeed. It's unfortunate that Evelyn herself couldn't be here to see it. Her indisposition has worsened, I'm afraid. The doctor has recommended complete rest." Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Ladies exchanged knowing glances. Young women were known to suffer from nerves before important social events, particularly weddings. Nothing unusual there. Frederick felt his stomach twist with anxiety. Where was she? What had they done to her? As the guests began to circulate again, champagne flowing freely, Thomas approached Frederick. "A triumph, Mr. Holloway," he said loudly for the benefit of those nearby, clapping him on the shoulder like an old friend. Then, more quietly, "Remember our agreement. Leave now. Go directly to your studio. James will visit you tomorrow with your payment." Frederick nodded stiffly. "Of course. Please give Miss Blackwood my best wishes for a swift recovery." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. Thomas's eyes hardened at the implied question. "I certainly shall." With no choice but to comply, Frederick collected his coat and hat from Harrison. As the butler showed him out, he glanced back at the portrait. In the warm lamplight, Evelyn's painted eyes seemed to follow him, filled with accusation. Had he failed her? Was she still somewhere in the house, perhaps locked in her room? Or had she somehow managed to escape on her own? Outside, the night air was cold, the fog rolling in thick from the Thames. It clung to the cobblestones and wrapped around the gas lamps, diffusing their light into hazy orbs. Frederick descended the steps slowly, mind racing. He couldn't leave, not without knowing what had happened to Evelyn. But how could he get back inside? The house was filled with guests, servants, and at least 2 men who would happily see him dead if he interfered with their plans. As he reached the bottom of the steps, a carriage pulled up alongside him. The door opened, revealing James Blackwood's face, half hidden in shadow. "Get in," James ordered, his voice flat. Frederick hesitated, then complied. What choice did he have? Perhaps this would lead him to Evelyn. The carriage door closed behind him with a definitive click, and immediately they were moving, pulling away from the estate. The sound of the horses' hooves on cobblestones and the creak of the carriage wheels were the only sounds for several long moments. "Where are we going?" Frederick asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Through the carriage window, he could see they were heading away from the fashionable part of town toward the darker, more industrial areas. James watched him impassively. His face was half illuminated by the occasional street lamp they passed, giving him a sinister theatrical appearance. "You lied to us, Mr. Holloway." Frederick's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "There is no Northern Star leaving for Paris tonight. No reservation for a Catherine Wells." "We checked." James's voice was calm, matter of fact, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had been angry. Frederick swallowed hard. "I must have been mistaken about the ship's name." "Stop," James cut him off, raising a gloved hand. "We know exactly what you were doing. Buying time, perhaps hoping to create a distraction and find my sister." He leaned forward, his face now fully visible in the dim light. "Where is she really going? Who is helping her?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Frederick insisted, forcing indignation into his voice. "Your sister asked for my help, yes, but I refused. I told her I wanted no part in family disputes." He met James's gaze steadily, though his heart was pounding so loudly he feared the other man might hear it. James studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, interrupted only by the sounds of the carriage and the occasional shout from the streets they passed. Then he laughed softly, the sound devoid of any warmth. "You know, I almost believe you. You don't seem the heroic type." He settled back against the leather seat. "But it doesn't matter now." "What do you mean? Where is Evelyn?" Frederick couldn't keep the concern from his voice. "My sister has been sedated, for her own good." James's tone was almost clinical. "By morning, she and Lord Hastings will be on their way to his country estate. The wedding will take place there, in private." He adjusted his gloves, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle. "Hastings understands the situation. He prefers a biddable wife, and certain medications can ensure that outcome." Frederick felt a surge of anger. The casual way James spoke of drugging his own sister, of condemning her to a life of chemical imprisonment, was monstrous. "You can't just... We can do whatever is necessary to protect our family and our interests," James interrupted coldly. "As we're about to demonstrate." The carriage was moving away from the city center now, toward the river. The streets became narrower, darker, the buildings more dilapidated. The respectable London of galleries and theaters and gentlemen's clubs had given way to the London of warehouses and docks and desperate poverty. Frederick's sense of dread grew with each turn. They weren't heading toward his studio. "Where are you taking me?" The question came out steadier than he expected, given the fear that was now a cold, hard knot in his stomach. James smiled thinly. "To complete our business, Mr. Holloway. You know too much. Normally we would simply make you disappear, like Phillips. But that might raise uncomfortable questions, given your presence at tonight's event." The carriage slowed, then stopped. Through the window, Frederick could see they were at the edge of the Thames, in a deserted industrial area. Warehouses loomed in the fog, most dark and empty at this hour. The smell of the river, mud and sewage and rotting things, seeped into the carriage. A distant ship's horn sounded, mournful in the night. "So instead," James continued, "we're going to have a different kind of accident." The carriage door opened. 2 burly men stood outside, dock workers by the look of them, with rough hands and weathered faces, but with the hard eyes of men who did more than just load cargo. They were the kind of men who knew how to hurt others and felt nothing while doing it. "These gentlemen will escort you to your new studio," James said, his voice silky with satisfaction. "A shame about the fire that's about to break out there. So many artists use flammable materials. So careless." Frederick lunged across the carriage, grabbing for James, fueled by desperation and rage. His fingers closed around the other man's throat for a brief, satisfying moment before the men were pulling him out. A blow to his stomach doubled him over, leaving him gasping for breath, stars dancing in his vision. "Your portrait of my sister will be quite valuable after your tragic death," James called as the men dragged Frederick toward a waiting wagon. A final masterpiece from a talent extinguished too soon. Frederick struggled, but a second blow to the head left him dazed. He was vaguely aware of being thrown into the wagon, of rough hands binding his wrists with coarse rope that bit into his skin. The taste of blood filled his mouth where his lip had split. His last coherent thought before darkness claimed him was of Evelyn's portrait and the message he had hidden there. "She knows what we did." Not a warning to her, as he had intended, but a testament. Evidence that might someday bring the Blackwoods to justice, even if he wouldn't live to see it. Frederick woke to the smell of smoke, acrid, choking. It filled his lungs and made his eyes water. He was lying on the floor of his studio, his head pounding with each heartbeat, his hands still bound behind his back. Through watering eyes, he could see flames already consuming the curtains, licking up the walls, devouring his sketches and paintings. Years of work, of memories, of art that had defined his life, all being reduced to ash before his eyes. The men had done their work well. The fire had been set in multiple places and was spreading rapidly. The heat was already intense, sweat streaming down his face and soaking his shirt. He had perhaps minutes before the entire studio was engulfed. He rolled onto his side, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. Moving was agony. His ribs protested where he'd been struck, and his head throbbed mercilessly. But he had to get out. He refused to die here, refused to let the Blackwoods win so easily. With his bound hands, he pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet. The door to the stairwell was already engulfed in flames. His only hope was the window overlooking the alley behind the building. If he could break it, perhaps someone would hear the noise, see the fire, raise an alarm. Staggering through the thickening smoke, Frederick knocked over a table of painting supplies. Glass bottles shattered, turpentine spilling across the floor. The flames leapt higher, fed by the flammable liquid, a wave of heat washing over him that singed his eyebrows and made his skin feel tight and hot. He reached the window and tried to lift the sash with his bound hands. It didn't budge, painted shut years ago and never opened. In desperation, he grabbed a wooden stool and smashed it against the glass. Once, twice. On the third blow, the window shattered with a satisfying crash. Cool night air rushed in, momentarily clearing the smoke around him. Frederick coughed violently, his lungs burning as they tried to expel the smoke he had inhaled. He could hear shouts now from the street, people noticing the fire, but it was too late for anyone to save the building. The flames had taken hold too thoroughly, fed by his paints and solvents and the aged timber of the old structure. Frederick cleared the remaining glass from the frame with his elbow, cutting himself in the process, but barely feeling the pain through the rush of adrenaline. He climbed awkwardly onto the sill, balancing precariously with his hands still bound behind him. The alley below was dark, the cobblestones at least 20 feet down. A fall from this height could kill him, or at the very least break bones, but staying meant certain death as the floor beneath him began to groan and crack from the heat. As he prepared to jump, a movement in the alley below caught his eye. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a woman in a dark cloak, her face tilted up toward him. The hood fell back, revealing her face in the flickering light of the fire. "Evelyn." "Jump!" she called, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "I can't catch you, but I've found help." Two more figures appeared beside her, men in workmen's clothes, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. They quickly positioned themselves below the window, arms outstretched. Frederick didn't hesitate. The heat at his back was unbearable now, the smoke making it impossible to breathe. He launched himself from the window, tumbling through the air for a sickening moment before crashing into the men below. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and pain shot through his shoulder as he landed awkwardly, but he was alive. "Quickly," Evelyn urged as the men cut the ropes binding his wrists. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes wide with fear, but also determination. "The fire will draw attention. We need to be gone before anyone arrives." Frederick staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. He looked up at his studio, now fully engulfed in flames. The windows shattered one by one from the heat, showering the alley with glass. Smoke billowed into the night sky, and he could hear the distant sound of fire bells as the brigade was alerted. "How did you find me? How did you escape?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "No time," she said, pulling him deeper into the shadows as shouts began to echo from the street. People were gathering, pointing up at the burning building. "I'll explain once we're safe." The men led them through a maze of alleys and narrow streets, away from the fire and the gathering crowd. Frederick stumbled along, each breath painful, his head still throbbing from the blow he had received. Evelyn supported him, her arm around his waist, surprisingly strong for someone of her slight build. Finally, they reached a small wharf some distance from the main docks. A boat was moored there, not the merchant vessel Frederick had arranged, but a smaller craft meant for river travel. A single lantern burned at its bow, casting a feeble light over the weathered decking. "This will take us downriver," Evelyn explained as they boarded. "To Gravesend. There's a ship waiting there. Not the one you arranged, but one that will serve our purpose." Frederick collapsed onto a bench, exhaustion finally overtaking him. "Your father, your brother. They said you were sedated, being taken to Hastings' estate." Evelyn's mouth twisted in a bitter smile, a flash of anger crossing her face. "They tried, but Harrison, our butler, he's been loyal to me since I was a child. He switched the sedative for colored water and helped me slip out through the servants' entrance. I was already gone when James went to check on me after speaking with you. But how did you know where to find me?" "I didn't, not at first. I went to your studio hoping to warn you, but you weren't there. Then I saw James's men arrive with you, unconscious. I followed, keeping to the shadows. When they set the fire and left, I ran to find help." She glanced at the two men sitting at the other end of the boat, dock workers she had persuaded to help with the last of her jewelry. A sapphire pendant that had belonged to her mother, she explained, worth enough to buy not just their assistance but their silence as well. Frederick shook his head in disbelief. "You risked your life coming back for me. Why?" "Because you were willing to help me," she said simply. "And because I couldn't let them kill another person. There has been enough death already." The boat began to move, its small engine chugging softly as it pulled away from the wharf. Behind them, the glow of the fire was still visible, a bright spot against the night sky. Frederick thought of his studio, his paintings, his life's work, all gone now. And yet, he was alive. Evelyn was alive. They had escaped. "What will you do now?" he asked, watching her profile in the dim light. She looked different already, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual severe style, her expensive dress exchanged for simpler clothing that wouldn't attract attention. "We're bound for Amsterdam, then on to Paris," she said. "I have some distant relations in France who might help us. After that," she shrugged, "I have enough money to establish us somewhere they won't find us." "Us?" Frederick repeated, not sure he had heard correctly through the ringing in his ears. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "Unless you have other plans? You can't return to London now. They'll be watching for you. And once they realize we've both escaped..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The Blackwoods would never stop looking for them, not after what they knew. Frederick thought of the portrait he had created, now hanging in the Blackwood mansion, the hidden message that no one would likely discover for years, perhaps decades. A small act of defiance that might someday bring the truth to light. "No," he said finally. "I have no other plans." She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. In that moment, despite his injuries, despite the loss of everything he had built, Frederick felt a surge of hope. They were alive. They were free. And perhaps together they could build a new life, far from the shadows of London. London, 1952. In the grand entrance hall of the Blackwood mansion, workers carefully crated the portrait of Evelyn Blackwood. The once great house was being emptied, its contents either sold at auction or donated to museums. The last of the Blackwood line had died without heirs, ending a dynasty that had already been in decline for decades. The portrait, considered a masterpiece by the tragically short-lived artist Frederick Holloway, was being donated to the Thornfield Museum of Fine Arts, along with several other paintings from the family collection. Few remembered the scandal that had briefly surrounded the artist's death and Evelyn Blackwood's disappearance. Time had softened the edges of the story, turning it into a footnote in London's history. As the workers sealed the crate, none of them noticed the faint, almost invisible writing at the bottom of the canvas. Words that had remained hidden for over 50 years, waiting for someone to discover them. "She knows what we did." Present day. I stare at the portrait in our conservation lab, the UV light still illuminating the eerie blue script. "She knows what we did." The words glow against the dark canvas, a message from the past finally revealed after more than a century of silence. My research over the past week has revealed fragments of the story. Frederick Holloway, a promising portrait artist who reportedly died in a studio fire in 1897, though no body was ever found. The newspapers of the time described it as a tragic accident, noting the flammable materials commonly found in artists' studios. Evelyn Blackwood, who disappeared the same night, rumored to have suffered a nervous breakdown and died in a private sanitarium. The society columns expressed sympathy for the Blackwood family, facing such tragedy on the very night meant to celebrate their daughter's engagement. Then there was the Blackwood shipping empire, which collapsed in the early 1900s amid investigations into opium smuggling and financial irregularities. Lord Thomas died in 1903, reportedly of a heart attack, though rumors of suicide circulated. James Blackwood fled to the continent, eventually drinking himself to death in a Paris hotel in 1905. The family name, once synonymous with power and prestige, faded into obscurity. But there are gaps in the historical record, questions that remain unanswered. What really happened to Evelyn Blackwood and Frederick Holloway? Were they truly victims of separate tragedies, or was there more to the story? Until today. This morning a package arrived for me. No return address, just my name and the museum's address in careful handwriting. The paper was expensive, the kind used for formal invitations, and the handwriting had an old-fashioned elegance to it. Someone educated in an era when penmanship was still considered an important skill. Inside was a journal, its leather binding cracked with age, its pages yellowed and brittle. The leather was soft to the touch, worn smooth by decades of handling. The spine was reinforced with newer material, suggesting someone had taken pains to preserve it. The first entry is dated October 17, 1897, 3 days after the infamous fire that supposedly claimed Frederick Holloway's life. It's written in French, the handwriting hurried but legible. We have reached Paris safely. He insists we maintain our new identities. She fears her father's reach, and perhaps she is right to do so. I find myself looking over my shoulder at every turn, expecting to see James Blackwood's cold eyes watching me. The burns on my hands are healing slowly, but the doctor assures me I will paint again. He says we should travel south, perhaps to Italy or Greece, somewhere we can start anew, where the Blackwood name means nothing. I turn the pages carefully, scanning entries that span decades. Frederick and Evelyn in Florence, living quietly in an apartment overlooking the Arno River. Their marriage in 1899. A private ceremony with only a few trusted friends in attendance. The birth of their daughter, Catherine, in 1902, described by Frederick in loving detail. She has her mother's eyes and, I fear, her stubborn nature as well. Their eventual settlement in a small village in southern France, where Frederick resumed painting under a new name, gaining modest recognition for landscapes that bore only the faintest resemblance to his earlier style. The entries become less frequent as the years pass, but no less detailed. Frederick writes of their daughter's marriage, the birth of grandchildren, the quiet joy of a life built far from the shadows of London. He mentions reading news of the Blackwood family's downfall with mixed emotions, satisfaction that justice had finally caught up with them, but sadness for the innocent people harmed along the way. The final entry is dated 1947, written in a shaky hand that bears little resemblance to the confident strokes of the earlier pages. He passed peacefully in her sleep last night, 50 years together, yet it seems only yesterday that she appeared in that alley, my savior in the darkness. Our daughter has urged me to record the full truth of what happened in London all those years ago. Perhaps someday, when the last of the Blackwoods is gone, it will be safe to do so. For now, this journal must remain hidden, as we have hidden ourselves all these years. But I have not forgotten the portrait, my last work as Frederick Holloway. Somewhere in London, it still exists, bearing its secret message, a message that was meant as a warning, but became our testament. She knows what we did, and in the end, knowing was enough to save us both. I close the journal, my fingers lingering on the weathered cover. It feels warm to the touch, alive with the history it contains. I look up at the portrait, at Evelyn Blackwood's enigmatic expression. Not a nervous bride-to-be, as the official record claimed, but a young woman on the verge of escape, a woman who knew too much and refused to be silenced. The journal doesn't explain how it found its way to me, or why it arrived precisely when I discovered the portrait. Could it be the work of descendants of Frederick and Evelyn? A coincidence? Or something more mysterious? The past reaching out to ensure its story is finally told? All I know is that after 70 years in darkness, Sealed in a crate that no one bothered to open, Evelyn Blackwood's portrait will finally be displayed. Her story, their story, will be told. The hidden message revealed. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some truths demand to be known, no matter how long it takes. And sometimes, a portrait is more than just a portrait. It's a key to the past, waiting for the right person to turn it. I carefully lift the portrait, feeling the weight of its history in my hands. Evelyn's eyes seem to meet mine, sharing a secret across more than a century of silence. In the hidden writing, in the journal, in the portrait itself, two people who history had declared dead have found their voice again. She knows what we did, I whisper to the empty lab, and now so do I. The remarkable story of Frederick Holloway and Evelyn Blackwood wouldn't remain hidden any longer. Their escape from the shadows of power and privilege, their courage in the face of danger, their love story that spanned decades, all of it would finally come to light. As I prepare the portrait for exhibition, I can't help but wonder about the timing of it all. Why now? Why me? Is it mere coincidence that I share the Blackwood name with the subject of the portrait? Is it chance that placed this painting in my hands, that brought the journal to my door? Perhaps some questions don't need answers. Perhaps it's enough to know that Frederick and Evelyn lived, loved, and died on their own terms, far from the darkness they escaped. Their portrait, with its hidden message, had waited patiently for over a century to tell its story. And now, at last, it would. I carefully place the portrait on an easel, positioning it so the hidden message can be seen under the special UV lighting we've installed. Next to it, a display case holds the journal, open to Frederick's final entry. Together they tell a story of corruption exposed, of escape, of a new life forged from the ashes of the old. The exhibition opens tomorrow. Secrets in plain sight. The extraordinary story of the Blackwood portrait has already generated interest in the press. People are fascinated by the idea of a message hidden in plain view for over a century, waiting for modern technology to reveal it. But the real story, the human story of Frederick and Evelyn, is what will captivate them once they arrive. As I turn off the lights in the conservation lab, leaving just the UV illumination on the portrait, I glance back one last time. In that eerie blue light, Evelyn's face seems different, more determined, perhaps even smiling slightly. I could swear her eyes follow me as I move toward the door. "Sleep well," I whisper to her. "Your story is safe now." And somewhere, perhaps the spirits of Frederick and Evelyn Holloway, the artist and his muse, the lovers who escaped the shadows, finally rest in peace, knowing that the truth has at last come to light. The portrait was never meant to be found, but I'm glad it was.